This gives me a minute to start talking about Sam McAfee. Different background, different story. So he's a product development coach and author at Startup Patterns. I think we'll hear all about that. The way he describes it, he's a 20-year Silicon Valley veteran. He doesn't look it, but that's a lot of years. He helps companies build and scale digital products, find product market fit. That's near and dear to my heart, so I'm very interested in some of that. And also help improve development capabilities. That's a core message. He's here to probably improve our capabilities too, so I'll turn it over to him.
I've been out in the Bay Area for 20 years or so, maybe a little longer. I'm originally from the East Coast, social sciences background, and I came out to California trying to find myself in about 1997 and found it to be very difficult, actually, because I didn't know where I was. So, you know, I was the guy with a bunch of my friends out here in San Francisco. I was the one social sciences person, the one out of a group of engineers. And I noticed pretty early on as we would like go out to dinner and like go to movies and stuff that, you know, they were all like living lavish lifestyles during the dot-com boom, and I was sort of scraping by looking for coins in the couch to buy, you know, ramen and whatnot. And so eventually, around the eve of the millennium, they encouraged and cajoled me to get into the tech scene in some way. So they said, you know, if you just get like a real job, you know, maybe doing some HTML, like you can, you know, you won't have to borrow money from us all the time for pizza and whatnot. So, so I did. I got a book. I got the O'Reilly Webmaster in a Nutshell book, which some of you may remember. And I took a picture of myself holding the book and put it up on Craigslist, which was still a thing in those days. And like in an hour, I had like 100 job offers. So, you know, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but only just. Like, it was really that crazy. So I got sort of sucked into being a self-taught web developer during the boom, and found really early that I really liked technology. I really took to web development and software engineering pretty quickly. And that led to a bunch of freelance gigs, doing all kinds of wacky work for startups of the day, somehow survived the first crash. So the first 5 years of my career was really around learning what it means to become a good software engineer. So I went very deep into technical practices. I got exposed to Agile pretty early on, doing, you know, test-driven development and design patterns and continuous integration and all of that good stuff that engineers should be doing if they're any good. And that was really important to me. Like, make everything really, really good. Make the code really solid. Really care about the architecture of what you're building. As I gradually morphed from a freelancer into having an agency, and I got really into how to run teams of organizations doing various kinds of product development work for clients. And so the second sort of 5 years or so were all about teams and process. So I went even further into Agile, got exposed to this lean stuff, and so a lot of it was how do you organize groups of people shipping product and make sure that they're building the right thing for the customer. That led to a lot of code, many, many lines of code, some of them I wrote myself, that no one ever used and no one ever wanted. And so the sort of the third 5 years or so was around the birth of lean startup and customer development and that kind of stuff, which really resonated with me because the idea of shipping things that nobody wants really hurt and it really sucked. And so I spent another chunk of time really getting into business models and product management. We eventually shut down our agency, and I went on to be a technology leader in a series of different organizations, small and large, where I learned more about how to apply those skills. One of those organizations was an agency called Neo. I was at Neo at a time when I think Thibault was just sort of doing some of that early stuff in his bio slide, so we crossed paths around 2013. My colleague David Bland is also here. He was a Neo alumni. So learned a lot about how to get to product market fit, in large organizations. And one of the things we ran into a lot, which I think Thibaut very diplomatically sort of implied but didn't say explicitly, is sometimes the leadership of an organization gets in the way of what you're trying to do. So for the last 3 years or so, I've been an independent freelance consultant. I've kind of moved away from writing code and leading teams, and am more focused on trying to help do change initiatives in large organizations. So it might be helping people with an Agile transformation. It might be helping people build an innovation lab. It might be doing lean startup experiments in a small company or at scale. But one of the things I'm really keenly aware of is how hard it is to change behavior in large organizations. And usually it's the leadership that is mostly in the way, right? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So show of hands if you are in a position where you are trying to lead or even influence some kind of new change or behavior within your organization. Okay, so a fair number of you, right? So it's kind of hard, right? So our story begins at dusk on the windswept plains of the Eurasian steppe. It's, let's say, about 10,000 years ago, and a small band of Neolithic nomads have just pitched camp after a long hike chasing herds that they depend on for food across the mountains and the plains. And everyone's had dinner, and they're all gathering around the fire to listen to the stories of the elders, right? And so, you can imagine the elder, her hair is gray, she's frail, but her eyes are very youthful, and her mind is super sharp. And as people eat, they gather closer around the fire to listen to stories of heroes past who have gone through some sort of experience that helped form the reality that this tribe follows, right? And so the elder is telling stories about heroes that are going out beyond the boundaries of what the tribe is used to, right? So when you think about these boundaries, right, like this is a group of people that live in a world that's much smaller than ours, right? And those boundaries, the forests, the rivers that are out there, the unknown, are very dangerous, right? So like leaving the boundaries of the tribe might mean the difference between life or death. And so people listen to these stories and they learn that it's really important to follow the parables of what the group is telling you so that you can protect yourself, right? They don't even have necessarily a sense of objective reality beyond the boundaries, right? They're sort of like the little world that we know where we all work together to survive. And the stories that are told every night around the campfire become the fabric of that reality. It informs the behaviors that we can follow, how we stay in the in-group versus being pushed out, because being pushed out means being eaten by a bear or something, right? So we all have to pull together, right? So those stories really affect how we think about what's possible in the world. And words are very powerful to the human psyche, right? So the great Joseph Campbell, very prolific writer and researcher of cultural and literary works, who you may know of as being the progenitor of the hero's journey from storytelling and literature, did an enormous amount of work examining cultural stories from all over the globe, written in oral histories. And in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, published in 1949, Campbell basically proposes that there's sort of one grand narrative that all stories pretty much follow, right? And it looks a little something like this. There's a normal situation, maybe we're in our village and there's sort of the boundary of what's known and unknown, and there's some sort of troubling effect, some event that occurs that requires a hero. The hero then gets the call to action, to go, the call to adventure, to go beyond the threshold into the unknown, right? And once beyond the boundary, the hero has to go through a series of trials that test their mettle, and eventually leading to the nadir or the depths of despair, where they must finally grapple with either some kind of sacrifice, or make a bargain, or go through some sort of transformation to overcome the adversary, right? So the adversaries are usually gods or spirits of the sky or the forest that are setting up these trials for them, right? So the hero is going beyond the known into the unknown, and only then can they return to the place of their birth to tell the story of what they discovered beyond that boundary. And thereby they've pushed the boundary out a little further of what is in the known and unknown world. However, the catch is that the hero is fundamentally transformed by the experience. So they come back and they share the story, and it gets worked into the myths of that culture. But the people who are there in the village don't have any direct experience with what the hero saw. So they can only sort of listen and try to interpret, right? And so Joseph Campbell really understood this as being the ultimate tale of how cultures build their stories of what is real and what's beyond the boundaries of the unknown. Deeper still, he attached the hero's journey to a sense of the human experience, right? So the journey then becomes part of human transformation. The hero is the ego personified, going deep and going beyond. The journey is passing over the threshold from sort of the known typical world into the world of the subconscious. And the guide, the shaman, the priest, the spiritual leader, is the keeper of the secret knowledge, who themselves have actually been through a hero's journey and can relate to the experience that the hero is having, right? And so the problem is that when the hero goes through an experience like this, it's so profound and so ego-shattering that it's very hard to translate what you've experienced to people that are back in the village when you go back and try to tell them what you went through. So what ends up happening is that over the centuries, cultures are formed around these stories, and we go from the hero that has the original experience with the help of the guide to people who heard firsthand from the hero and maybe transcribed those into the tales and the cultural artifacts of the day. And over time, year over year, and translation after translation, the original meaning is lost in piles of dusty books, right? It's impossible for the people who have read several layers deep of translations to really get at all what the hero's experience is, right? So then you have this process by which an original, exciting, and mind-blowing experience gradually makes its way from tales around a campfire of direct experience to transcribed tales written down, maybe posted on Medium, something like that, gradually working its way into rule books and to-do lists and tasks and documentation, till finally the experience is so abstracted from the original hero's journey of what we learned that all of the original meaning is lost. This is why change in organizations is hard, because it turns out that these kinds of experiences, working in a startup, being in an agile organization, doing test-driven development, running experiments at scale, can really only be learned by direct experience. There's no binder, there's no manual, there's no document that you can read that will actually give you the experience. Moving on to a more recent part of the story, in the second half of the 19th century, the United States was emerging as an industrial power. And it was still pretty kludgy how we built things, right? So we made furniture, we made carriages, we made bullets, we made all kinds of different objects. And most of the manufacturing that happened in the second half of the 19th century, between the Civil War and World War I, was done by artisans of guilds, right? So there are apprentices, journeymen, and masters, more or less, doing different manufacturing techniques to produce for the world market. And they all had their own unique ways of doing things. The masters carried around this secret knowledge of things that they had figured out over many years of work. And it was all beautiful craftsmanship, but very inconsistent. And the needs of the US market at the time was to produce for scale. Build as much stuff as possible and get it to market. So Frederick Winslow Taylor comes along, born in 1856, coming of age during this time period, and here's the call from the White House to try to improve the efficiency of production. So he goes out and he joins up as a clerk at Bethlehem Steel, sort of circa 1870s, 1880s, and he developed something called the Principles of Scientific Management. Some of you may have heard of Frederick Winslow Taylor. He's known particularly for what they call time and motion studies, right? So someone's going to take some ore and transform it into molten steel and then, build a bunch of steel bricks that can be used in some sort of construction or something. He would break everything down in the process from step by step and measure how long it took to do each thing. And the idea was that if you could optimize the process step by step, what you would get is more production faster at the scales that we needed to compete with the other colonial powers. So he was solving a real problem, and it worked. The problem was that in order to do this, he needed to create two different classes of workers, right? So remember, we're talking about a guild system with masters that have secret knowledge about how they work, passing it on to their journeymen who oversee apprentices, and everything is inconsistent. Now we've got massive amounts of consistency, but now we've taken the planning process and separated it from the production system. So you have your clerks or your planners in an office with chalkboards designing the system, and then we've de-skilled all the actual production. So you have line workers that are just doing their one little bit, and they don't really know how it fits into the larger process. What ended up happening was a real fall off in quality, because by the time we would realize that there's a defect down the line, we would have created 10,000 of those components, and it would be too late to really save any of that stuff. So enormous amount of waste was created by separating people who do the thinking and people who do the doing. So when Principles of Scientific Management was published in 1911, shortly before World War I, it was wildly popular. It's made its way into Harvard Business School literature, into the first management consulting firm on the planet, McKinsey, and then later all of the other management consulting firms really embraced a Taylorist way of thinking about things. So a lot of the stories that we tell ourselves in large organizations now around corporate culture is related to Taylor's separation of those clerks and planners, who, by the way, later grew up to become managers. That's what we started calling them. And then you have the workers on the line doing the stuff, right? So that separation was really problematic because of the quality problem. These guys, totally separately at first and later together, discovered that there was a different way to do the quality, right? So one of the things that Deming was responsible for was figuring out quality control for the war effort in World War II. So this is a full sort of 40 years later. Deming looked at the world of production and decided that it was actually a lot smarter to work in a cycle, right? So he came up with this idea of the plan, do, check, and act cycle, the PDCA cycle, which looks really similar to other iterative cycles we might see, like build, measure, learn, or red, green, refactor, or sprints in an Agile process. He was really the first one to come up with this idea of figuring out what's wrong, having a hypothesis about it, making a change to the system, and then trying the new thing and measuring the result, right? This was basically the birth of lean. And the other thing that Deming was really passionate about was that the doers and the thinkers should come back to be the same people again. So it was really important for people on the manufacturing line to actually be the ones who could be empowered to make changes to the system so that they could improve it, because having that be separated all the way to management was very slow and efficient. So Deming was so successful in the war effort that he made his way into being assigned to go to Japan for the reconstruction effort and befriended the Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers, among whom Taiichi Ohno was one. And Taiichi Ohno is sort of famous for having created the Toyota production system, which the descendants of which include Lean and Six Sigma and Lean Startup and many other thought processes and methodologies. So there was a real collaboration among thinkers like these folks to try to bring the thinking and doing back together in the teams, right? And you can draw a direct line from the work that these guys were doing to the movement of Agile, the movement of Lean Startup, several other sorts of creative methodologies for doing rapid prototyping and shipping products to market and that sort of thing. Among whom, David Marquet is an example, right? So David Marquet wrote this great book called Turn the Ship Around. Marquet describes his experience being a naval submarine captain who was training for a year on a particular submarine that he was supposed to be assigned to. And at the last minute, Marquet was reassigned to the ship that was completely something he didn't know anything about, didn't know how it worked, didn't know how it was laid out. And the crew was the worst crew in the nuclear sub fleet at the time. And so suddenly he shows up and has to figure out how to get these guys ready to be going to sea. And what they ended up doing, somewhat by accident and somewhat on purpose through a series of iterations, was he stopped giving orders and started getting his crew to figure out what they thought they were supposed to do and announce it to him and say, like, Captain, I intend to change the filters right now, or I intend to submerge the ship. And so that way he could sort of hear what was going on, intervene if necessary, but basically kind of let these teams learn how to run the organization themselves. And what ended up happening? They ended up having the best performing crew in the entire nuclear submarine fleet within a couple of years. And so this is sort of a legendary story of moving the authority down to where the information is that David talks about in his book. It's very interesting. Another example of this, if you haven't seen it, Drive by Daniel Pink, talks also about the motivation of people, right? So you have people who are doing work in a knowledge economy, and it turns out that if you're doing things that are not rote, routine processes, like working on an assembly line, external motivators like quotas and bonuses and things do not work. Instead, you need intrinsic motivation to produce quality output. So I'm specifically also thinking about software engineers, in this case, as I am one, and I'm frequently asked, how do we motivate our software engineers? Can we give them bonuses? Can we beat them with sticks? Like, what's going to get these guys to ship? And the answer is, frankly, they need, as a team and as individuals, to have autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? So Pink talks about this same idea of having the authority and the skill pushed together in the same group of individuals. Yet another example emerges, totally by coincidence, from the military as well. General Stanley McChrystal, who oversaw the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, has a fantastic book called Team of Teams, which is about, he basically went through a lot of the same processes of having to unlearn that Taylorist top-down hierarchical way of organizing things, right? So what I want you to be thinking about, by the way, in this process and thinking about the people that you work with is how can we create organizations that allow decision-making to be done as early as the information is coming in from the field, from our experiments, from our production systems, as possible. So that requires a lot of letting go. It requires a lot of delegation. It requires succession planning. It requires getting out of the way. We as maybe product managers have a hard time getting out of the way sometimes. We have a hard time maybe having trust in our teams. But a lot of this comes to giving them the tools and the information that they need to make the right decision, the decision that we would have made if we were standing right there, right? So this is where a lot of leadership literature is going. As I'm wrapping up, let's just look at why it's so hard to be objective. Why? So I could say all this stuff, and you could listen to it, and you could take it with you and go try it. It's not going to work like that because of what we talked about in the beginning with the importance of direct experience. Right? So Without trying it, you're not going to learn it. I can't just tell you what you should be doing. One of the reasons is because of the way that the brain works, right? So Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize economist, wrote the book called Thinking Fast and Slow about a decade ago. Really a foundational thinker in behavioral economics. And one of the most fascinating things about Kahneman's work, and this is particularly interesting if you're working in a group of people and there are disagreements or people jump to conclusions. Kahneman identified that the mind works in two different systems. There's system one, sort of developed from the savannas when we were early in our evolution. It's the part of the brain that helps you run away from a panther if it's hiding in the bushes, right? So we're really good at pattern matching. So system one is fast and automatic and is built on all of the assumptions that are really already wired into your brain from things that you've learned or experienced before. It is not readily accessible. You don't know when you're doing it, but it's effortless. The thing is, when we're making decisions, particularly in a complex environment, when there's lots of opinions at stake and people are disagreeing, it's very easy to just kick into system one and make an assumption and say, we have to do it this way because I just have a gut feeling, right? However, we need to learn how to slow ourselves down and access system two. System two is a deliberative analytical process that is much slower. Unfortunately, system two is also subject to getting tired and just falling back and listening to whatever system one is screaming in its ear, right? So what Kahneman discovered was that system two is really falls apart under pressure of stress, lack of sleep, lack of nutrition, low blood sugar, any number of things. But it's worth it when we're having discussions around like our data in our experiment and what is the next move that we should make, that we're very careful to be aware of our own biases in our decision-making process, right? Another thing to think about is that the emotions that happen within teams when they're under that pressure is really, really important, right? So we like to walk through the world believing that thinking and feeling are two separate things. It turns out, because neuroscience, that isn't actually true, right? So I encourage you to take a look at Lisa Barrett Feldman's work. She's a neuroscience, How Emotions Are Made, came out in 2017. It's one of many books on this kind of literature. But what's fascinating about this is that it turns out that thinking and feeling are actually two sides of the same coin. It's how the brain's cognition actually works, right? And so things to keep in mind are that emotions are not actually reactions to the world. They are generated by the brain in response to previous experiences. It's a set of predictions, basically. So as information is coming in, the brain is watching that information and making predictions about how you should feel given how you felt the last time something like this might have happened, right? And it's constantly updating those predictions. So you're never not thinking and feeling. You're doing both all the time, and they're actually part of the same system, right? So another thing to think about that's really important if you're going to try to overcome some of these biases and try to sort of be the hero to try to influence other people's cultural behaviors in your organization is that your own feelings are tied to your physical body, right? And so this is a little bit, this is probably a little far off the map for some of you guys, so bear with me for a second. Thing that I found really fascinating about Feldman's work is that from your brain's point of view, it's making predictions about how you should feel from external actors. So what that means specifically is that when you see the boss that really stresses you out, your body responds physiologically, your heart starts beating a little bit, your palms get sweaty, you're a little short of breath. When you think about that boss, even when they're not there, the same physiological responses will actually occur, right? Because as far as your brain is concerned, thinking about an instance of a thing is effectively the same thing as seeing that thing. There's a little bit of nuance between the two, but the physiological responses are very real, right? So it's all just a model of the world in the brain that the brain must explain. What that means is that you can use physical sensations that you're feeling to tune into what your emotions are about a situation to help you discover how to make the next move in a more intelligent manner. So again, thinking about how to change people's behavior, one of the things we have to remember is that we're going to have to overcome some of our own internal barriers and our own limitations to change first, before we're able to tackle changing behaviors of our colleagues, our bosses, our customers, whoever it is. So going inward is really important. Eric Berne, who I would put in order of as psychologists number 3 after Freud and then Jung, Berne came up with this idea that we are all sort of born princes and princesses. In other words, we have, as children, sort of life scripts that set us up to be creative, to be playful, to be encouraging, to work with other people. And actually, it's the influence of growing up that drives that playfulness and that curiosity out of us, right? And so one of our challenges in trying to overcome our internal barriers is to actually go back to find that inner child, that concept, inner child, which you've all heard. That comes from Berne, by the way. To be able to do that, you have to go pretty deep and find your own internal barriers and overcome them, right? Which is very hard work. But if you're not doing that yourself, there's no way you're going to be able to get other people on your team that are stuck to be able to do it as well. So the transformation really starts from within, right? Finally, there's also, talking a little bit more about those internal barriers that we feel when we're trying to make change. These are the barriers that when you're in a meeting where people are throwing ideas out and you've got a really good idea, and for some reason you kind of stop yourself, you're like, oh, my idea is stupid, no one's going to listen to me. That's an internal barrier, right? Or when you go to try to talk to a difficult coworker or a boss, and the conversation gets kind of flipped around and like taken out of your control and it doesn't go the way you wanted it to, that's typically because there's an internal barrier that's keeping you from really speaking your own truth and acknowledging your power and your intelligence, right? And so overcoming those barriers is very difficult because they start really early on. But it is possible through looking at how you're feeling in a moment, what those physical sensations are, and how they connect to the analytical parts of your brain to discover those barriers and start to overcome them. That is your individual hero's journey, right? Like that is the experience of going through new experiences and transforming yourself and being able to go to others and bring them along with you for the journey that is going to lead to really successful leadership of product organizations or any organizations for that matter, right? So just to recap, the stories that we tell ourselves of others who ventured into the unknown, those become doctrine very, very easily. If you were not originally there, you don't know what happened, you're going to read about it in a book, you're going to look at it in a diagram, you're going to go to a talk after work in a tower near the bay. People are going to tell you lots of stuff that may sound like it's something you should follow, but if you haven't yourself had that own experience, it's really hard to really understand what the fundamentals of it are. Those stories condition our behavior. We tend to respond to the reality based on the stories that we've heard, that we've accepted as true. This is especially true in big organizations where there's a lot of groupthink and a lot of process diagrams. It's very hard to overcome that stuff. So we have to start changing the stories that we tell ourselves about what's important and what our values are. And the first way to do that really is to go deep within and figure out what are the things that we believe and pull all that stuff out and analyze it and decide for ourselves which are the behaviors that we want to follow and which are those that we can let go of that we had believed just because we were told, but maybe those aren't really moving us in the right direction anymore, right? Like that is actually within your control to do that. Your job as a leader in your organization, whether you actually are in charge of people, they report to you, or whether you're just a change agent doing the best you can informally, your job is to overcome your own internal barriers first in order to inspire others. And it's absolutely possible, right? So finally, I thought this quote was pretty great. It's from actually the book is called Mindsets, sorry about that, by Carol Dweck. Warren Bennis is a great leadership expert from the 20th century who did an amazing amount of work. And one of the things that he pointed out after interviewing lots of leaders was they all agreed, all these leaders, that great leaders are made and not born. and they're made more by themselves than any external means. And anyone is capable of self-transformation. And probably don't have any questions, but that's all I got.
I will kick off with the first question. I hear you're teaching a workshop pretty soon that's related to this talk that you did. So can you give us a
sounds
quick
really familiar.
rundown of what the workshop is and what you're going to teach in that
Yeah,
workshop?
absolutely. So we're teaching a workshop, Mindful Product Leadership. The general idea is to figure out ways to make change in organizations. That's essentially the objective. So it's open to anyone who is trying to figure out how to become a leader in their organization or how to be a better leader in their organization. So we're talking about a context of people producing product as their deliverable, but you're doing it in teams or you are overseeing other people that have to ship things. And so managing people is very different than managing machines. And so we'll talk about how do you build those leadership skills, the communication, being able to manage up to executives, being able to have very difficult conversations when conflicts arise, how to kind of discover your own purpose, potential, and overcome those inner barriers. All of that will be part of this workshop, and I'd love to see you there.
We linked to the workshop in this event's details, so you can just pull up this event and right by his bio, you'll see the details of the workshop.
Cool.
Question.
Any other thoughts? All right.
Hi. I was wondering if you could share a story that maybe you used to tell yourself that you debunked for yourself midway through your career.
Totally. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So is there an example of a story that I used to tell myself, something that I believed that I was able to overcome? Yeah, absolutely. So there are many. I think probably the easiest for me to recount is that I am working for myself now, going on to the 4th year and having a great time doing it. It's a hard thing to be self-employed. There are lots of narratives around our culture that you need to, go get a job. Someone else has to kind of be your employer because it's too unstable to be a freelancer or entrepreneur. So when I was first freelancing, I still used to get job posts forwarded to me by my mom. Like she'd be like, hey, this might be like right up your alley. It says like engineering manager at .com and whatever. And I told her over and over again, like, no, I'm going to go out on my own and try to do this thing. The problem was that I had a lot of fear early on that I was just kind of faking it and I didn't deserve to be sort of doing my own work. I wasn't really valuable as a consultant. Those weren't things, by the way, that I was consciously aware of. I just noticed that I would sort of undermine my own behaviors here and there through fear and uncertainty. And it took a lot of time for me to realize, hey, I'm actually stopping myself short. I'm undermining myself because of these messages I've been getting from friends and family over the years about how things should be. So one of the things we do in the workshop that's actually really helpful for this is kind of brainstorming and coming up with what are all your shoulds. What are the things that we were told as we were kids or that we learned in college or heard from a boss or an executive of like how we should be, and figuring out which of those consciously we actually want to keep because those are in line with our values, and which are just bullshit that we can just leave by the side of the road and move on. But it's not until you're able to surface that stuff and really look at what it is, because it's very insidious. It's like programmed into how you think. So unless you have the opportunity to just stop and really expunge all that stuff on a bunch of sticky notes and have a really heartfelt discussion about it with your colleagues and your friends and family, you can't really see it. It's kind of hiding behind your eyes. So for me, that was a really big example. Yeah. Cool. Anyone else? Everyone's hot and tired. It's okay. I'll see you at the workshop. Okay, we have one more.
So we're talking about leadership. I also wondering about, because leaders are just real in a group. the other people are just assistants, you know, it's like providing feedback or collateral efforts to the leaders or the team generally. So for those associate positions, you know, like consultants, associate directors, associate product managers, and if you see something that, you know, say it can create like alerts or red flags that, you know, it could be existing in the current product, or it could be say in the near future. It's like, you know, you see an iceberg in front of, you know, Titanic.
Sure. Yeah.
And what's the best way to approach the leader, and, you know, in a more practical ways?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best way for me to answer that, it's sort of broadly speaking, how do you talk to leaders and executives when you have something important to say? The first thing to know is that they're not like you. They don't think the way you do. They got to that position because of the going through the Game of Thrones that exists at the top of most organizations, right? So there's sort of like a type of communication that they're able to do that most of us who actually do stuff and ship product don't have the time to deal with that kind of communication, right? So those folks are operating at a place where they're far from the data, and so they don't have a lot of time for details. And so it's really important to, I would say there's sort of two things that you need to do when you're trying to get a conversation with them to alert them to something or change their behavior. One is, just keep in mind, you have to sort of appeal to their self-interest, right? So that means that you approach the conversation looking to help or add value, not go up to them and say, hey, I have a problem and I want you to listen to me. Because people are doing that to them all day long, right? Instead, you see them in the elevator, you got like a minute and a half, and then you basically express as genuinely as possible actual curiosity about how they see the current situation from where they're standing, right? So it's sort of like, hey, so we're about to roll out this product, and like, you know, we're having some challenges down the engine room, but like, what's your perspective? So you're actually asking questions more than you're telling them the thing. It requires being a little crafty and being a little Socratic, but basically you kind of think of your questions in advance as a way to guide them to the point that you're trying to make and to try to do it as quickly as possible. The other thing is, keep in mind that you have to keep the conversation at a very high level of scope, because they don't have the details and they don't have time for the details. And so like when you're doing a presentation to an exec, having lots of charts and data is actually not going to help. What will help is being able to tell a story that resonates with their perspective from that high up in the organization. So that's sort of the guideline. It takes a lot of practice. It's not easy to do. But if you're going to start trying to have those conversations, those are the things that I would start with. Sure. Anyone else? Yes.
My name is Mike Campbell. Very happy to be here. I am an intern right now in a pharmaceutical company, and we get some meetings, 20 people from Germany, East Coast here. And I had a reflection from my colleague that he doesn't like to speak in this group because there's too much people and it doesn't make sense. And I was like, I don't agree with that. Like, if everyone don't want to talk, we always like hide behind the problem, and then there's like this side talk on the email, and I think it creates problems. So what is your thinking about, should we speak out when there are too much people in a meeting?
Yeah, so it's sort of a bigger problem, which is that people usually don't speak when they don't feel like they're going to be listened to. And they typically have evidence already of prior experiences when they weren't listened to. So it's not easy to overcome in that sort of environment where there's a sort of a top-down organization or a culture of fear, right? So yes, I would encourage him as his friend. You can go and say, listen, I think you should say what you think, because chances are, if he's thinking this problem, probably other people in the room are too, right? So it's like it just takes one person to come forward and have the courage to say the thing. But don't ignore that that's really hard to stick your neck out and to be brave in a room full of silence, right? And so you don't want to push too hard, because everyone needs to be able to feel supported first. And being, kind of shoved out, even if you're being encouraging, unless it's a really safe space, you might be setting him up for some sort of backlash. So you have to be careful about the context. It might be better to go to the person running the meeting and say, hey, we're going to have a whole bunch of people in this room. Some of them are actually a little nervous to raise their opinions. What can you do in the agenda to make sure that everyone gets a chance to talk, right? So then you're changing the whole environment, and it's less about him and his behaviors. It's more about creating a culture of communication and openness.
Hi, my name is Leticia Campos, and my question is, we were talking about how to drive change in organizations, especially when we don't necessarily have support from leadership, and how to lead this kind of changes.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask if you have any example of, like a practical example of change that you saw happening in a big corporation or a small one, but
Yeah.
that you can share with us. Thanks.
Couple. The first talk that we heard is a great example of change in an organization. I mean, like Thibaut was like right out front, you know, changing the way that they were approaching how to do this work. You talked about not having executive sponsorship as much in the beginning, and they had to kind of get scrappy. I've seen lots of other examples where, you know, there's a phrase, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. Right? So doing things differently in a large organization takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery, right? So it does require you to take risks. And I think that if you feel like it's worth it, and you can make a case after the fact that like, hey, we went and did things differently in our team because we read all this stuff and we saw these talks and we read these books and we had a feeling it was going to work. So we decided to try it, and lo and behold, it was successful, or we learned something, or, you know, we made some incremental change. I think that we just need more people in organizations just taking ownership, right? Like just kind of figuring out new ways to work. A lot of times the leaders in the departments and the organizations, they want people to take initiative. They want to have this innovative culture change and process change happening, and they don't actually know how to get people to do it, right? So I've been in places that are sort of the opposite of what you're saying, where the execs have said, okay, we're going to be innovative now, all right? Like we've had a top-down authoritarian culture where everybody was an order taker, and as of right now, you are all innovative. So be free and go create. And there's crickets, right? And everyone's sitting there like, oh my God, I'm so terrified, I have no idea what to do, because for the last 10 years, they've been telling us exactly what to do. And now we have to figure it out ourselves. So like that doesn't work either, right? So these executives are looking for people who are in their organizations that they can collaborate with, that they can sort of pick out as early leaders that will help them informally create change in an organization. Because remember that change in an organization does not happen by fiat. It's very, very hard to do it only in the grassroots, and it's almost impossible to do it just by command from the CEO. It happens by people having lots of viral one-on-one conversations about how they're working slightly different in their group, and you should try this too. And it sort of spreads more organically throughout the organization. So if you have the space to try different things, you know, and it's not going to get you in trouble, or maybe it'll only get you in a little bit of trouble, like maybe try it, right? And so show as an example of what working in a new way will do. And I think that's kind of the best advice that I have.